The world was gray. Gray sky, gray dust, gray buildings crumbling into gray rubble. John coughed, the dust scratching his throat. He pulled his tattered scarf higher, a futile attempt to filter the air. He was alone. Always alone. He had been alone for 5 years, ever since the bombs fell. He couldn't remember what year it was now. Didn't matter. Time meant nothing in this wasteland. He scavenged for scraps, hunted rats, drank rainwater collected in rusty cans. Survival was a full-time job. Sometimes John found himself talking to the dust devils that danced across the empty streets. He told them stories of his past, of a life before. A life with sunlight and laughter with his wife Sarah, her hand warm in his. Gone. All gone. He pushed on, legs aching, stomach gnawing with hunger. He had to reach the old supermarket before nightfall. It was dangerous to travel after dark. Things lurked in the shadows, things that whispered his name. It had been a beautiful spring day. Birds sang, children laughed, and the air smelled of fresh-cut grass. John had been grilling hamburgers in the backyard, Sarah laughing at his terrible jokes. Then the sirens wailed. The news report on the radio was panicked, confused. Enemy missiles. Incoming. John had pulled Sarah close, fear a cold knot in his stomach. They sought shelter in the basement, huddling together as the world outside shook with unimaginable violence. When they finally emerged, days later, it was to a nightmare. The sky was choked with smoke, the air thick with ash and the stench of death. Buildings were reduced to smoldering skeletons, and the silence was the most terrifying thing of all. The supermarket loomed before him, a concrete tomb. He slipped through a broken window, careful to avoid the shards of glass. The air inside was stale, thick with the smell of decay. He scanned the aisles, his heart a hard lump in his chest. Empty, all empty, except for the rats. He cursed, kicking a dented can of peaches. He was so tired of being hungry, so tired of being alone. He sank down against a dusty shelf, despair threatening to drown him. But John couldn't afford despair. Despair was a luxury for the dead. He forced himself to his feet, digging through his backpack. He had a few crackers left, hard as rocks, but they would have to do. He spent the night huddled in the back room of the supermarket, listening to the wind moan through the broken windows. He dreamed of Sarah, her face a pale blur in the darkness. He woke with a start, her name a choked whisper on his lips. The silence was absolute. He strained his ears, every nerve ending on high alert. The silence was wrong. He should have been able to hear the scuttling of rats, the wind whistling through the broken panes. Then he heard it, a soft thud. Footsteps. He froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the rusty pipe he carried for protection. He held his breath, listening as the footsteps slowly approached. He was not alone. Section 5. The Stranger's Gaze. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall, gaunt, with eyes that glinted in the dim light. John gripped the pipe tighter, his heart pounding against his ribs. The stranger was dressed in rags, his face hidden in the shadows of a hooded cloak. For a long moment they simply stared at each other, two predators sizing each other up. Then the stranger spoke, his voice raspy, as if unused for a long time. "You alone?" John hesitated, weighing his options. He could trust no one in this desolate world, but the stranger hadn't attacked yet, and there was something in his voice, a flicker of hope. John lowered the pipe slightly, his grip loosening. "Yes," he croaked, his voice thick with disuse. "I'm alone." The stranger nodded slowly, then pulled back his hood, revealing a face etched with weariness and a trace of fear. "They're coming," the stranger whispered, his eyes darting around the room. "They hunt at night." John felt a chill crawl down his spine. He had heard whispers of others, twisted and savage, driven mad by the horrors they had witnessed. "Who are they?" John asked, his voice barely a whisper. The stranger shook his head, his face grim. "It doesn't matter. They take what they want, and they don't leave survivors." Fear, sharp and cold, pierced through John's exhaustion. A blood-curdling scream echoed through the night. John's blood ran cold. The stranger grabbed his arm, urgency in his grip. "We have to go, now!" John didn't hesitate. He followed the stranger, adrenaline erasing his fatigue. They ran through the deserted streets, the darkness pressing in around them. The stranger moved with a surprising agility, his knowledge of the ruined city guiding their path. Behind them, the screams continued, drawing closer. John risked a glance over his shoulder. In the distance, he saw flickering shadows, grotesque silhouettes against the moonlit ruins. They were being hunted. The stranger led him to a crumbling building, partially hidden in the shadows of a collapsed overpass. He pushed open a heavy metal door, revealing a dimly lit staircase leading down into darkness. "Quickly," he hissed. "They won't follow us down here." John followed him down the stairs, the air growing heavy and stale. They reached a large chamber illuminated by flickering candles. A dozen pairs of eyes turned to stare at them, men and women, their faces etched with a mixture of hope and despair. The stranger turned to John, a grim smile on his face. "Welcome," he said, his voice hoarse. "You're safe now. But there's a price for safety. We're not who we used to be." John stared at the faces around him, their eyes glittering with a strange, feral light, and he knew. He was no longer alone, but he had never felt so lost. John stood on the roof of the building, watching the sun bleed into the horizon, painting the sky in hues of blood orange and bruised purple. It had been a year since he had joined the group, a year since he had last seen the sun set on the world above. He was no longer the man he had been. Survival had a way of stripping away everything but the raw instinct to live. He had done things, terrible things, to stay alive, things that haunted his dreams, things that made him question what it meant to be human. He looked up at the sky, at the stars beginning to appear in the fading light. Was there any hope left? Or was this all that remained, a world of shadows and whispers, where humanity had become a flickering candle in the encroaching darkness? He didn't know the answer, but as he turned away from the dying light, a single thought echoed in the silence of his heart. Survive. Just survive.